What happens when loyalty collides with conscience? When the very institution you've sworn to protect becomes the source of cruelty toward an innocent child? For 12 years, Marcus Wellington stood silent in the shadows of Buckingham Palace, his scarlet uniform a symbol of unwavering devotion to the crown. He watched princes grow into kings, witnessed state secrets that could topple governments, and kept his mouth shut through scandals that rocked the monarchy. But some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. When a young prince's cries echoed through marble corridors at 3 a.m, when powerful men in expensive suits gathered to discuss solutions to a 7-year-old's problematic behavior, Marcus faced a choice that would define not just his career, but his humanity. This is the story he was never supposed to tell. The story of how Prince Louis, fourth in line to the throne, became a pawn in a game of royal politics so twisted that even those sworn to protect him participated in his humiliation. It's a story about power, privilege, and the price of speaking truth to those who wear crowns. Some secrets die with those who keep them. This one refuses to stay buried. Marcus Wellington never imagined his silence would become his greatest burden. Standing at attention outside the blue drawing room of Buckingham Palace on a grey Tuesday morning in November, he looked every inch the perfect royal guard. His red uniform pressed to perfection, brass buttons gleaming, face set in the neutral expression that had served him well for over a decade. But, behind those steady brown eyes, a storm was brewing. The morning had started like any other. Wake at 4:30, physical training at 5, uniform inspection at 6:15, and positioned at his post by 7 sharp. Marcus had followed this routine for 12 years, through 3 different royal households, countless state visits, and more family dramas than most people see in a lifetime. He prided himself on being invisible when needed, protective when required, and absolutely silent always. But this morning was different. This morning, Prince Louis was scheduled for what the palace staff euphemistically called his special training session. Marcus had first noticed something was wrong 3 months earlier. Prince Louis, then just 7 years old, had begun showing up to public events with red eyes and a nervous tic that hadn't been there before. The boy who once charmed photographers with his cheeky grins and playful antics now flinched when adults approached him. The change was subtle enough that the public didn't notice, but Marcus had been trained to observe everything. The first incident Marcus witnessed directly happened on a Thursday evening in September. He had been assigned to night duty, which meant patrolling the private family quarters between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. These shifts were usually quiet, with only the occasional sound of staff preparing for the next day's activities. But that night, around midnight, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. Crying. Not the brief tears of a child who had skinned a knee or been denied a sweet before dinner. This was the heartbroken sobbing of someone whose world had been shattered. The sound came from Prince Louis's bedroom, a room that should have been filled with the peaceful sleep of childhood, not the desperate weeping of despair. Marcus had stopped outside the door, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. His training told him to investigate any unusual sounds in the royal quarters, but his orders regarding Prince Louis were very specific: observe and report, but do not interfere with disciplinary measures unless explicitly commanded by senior staff. The crying continued for nearly an hour. Marcus stood there the entire time, feeling each sob like a physical blow. When silence finally returned, he completed his patrol with mechanical precision, but sleep eluded him for the rest of that week. He began to pay closer attention to Prince Louis's daily routine. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about royal life. The 7-year-old prince was being subjected to what could only be described as systematic humiliation, all under the guise of preparing him for royal duties. The boy's tutors, handpicked by senior palace advisors, seemed to take pleasure in pointing out his mistakes. Marcus watched through doorways as Prince Louis was forced to stand at attention for hours while adults discussed his behavioral problems as if he weren't in the room. The child was made to apologize repeatedly for normal childhood behaviors, his natural curiosity and energy labeled as inappropriate for someone of his station. But it wasn't just the tutors. Marcus began to notice that other staff members treated Prince Louis differently than his siblings. Where Princess Charlotte received patient correction when she made mistakes, Prince Louis was subjected to harsh criticism. Where Prince George was allowed to be playful during private moments, Prince Louis was expected to maintain formal composure at all times. The breaking point came during what Marcus later learned was Prince Louis's first command exercise. The palace had arranged for the 7-year-old to give orders to a group of junior staff members, supposedly to teach him about leadership and authority. What actually happened was a carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to break the child's spirit. Marcus had been positioned outside the gold stagecoach room when he heard raised voices. Through the partially open door, he could see Prince Louis standing on a small platform, tears streaming down his face as adults in expensive suits shouted at him for giving inappropriate commands to servants who had been instructed to disobey everything he said. A real prince would command respect, one of the advisors had sneered, while Prince Louis stammered out apologies. Your brother understands authority. Your sister knows her place. What's wrong with you? The exercise continued for 2 hours. 2 hours of a 7-year-old boy trying desperately to figure out why nothing he said was right, why every attempt at leadership was met with scorn, why the adults around him seemed to hate him for reasons he couldn't understand. By the end, Prince Louis wasn't just crying. He was shaking, his small body racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his soul. That night, Marcus broke protocol for the first time in his career. Instead of filing his standard report, he requested a meeting with his superior officer, Captain Reynolds. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, and Marcus spent the night rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain what he had witnessed without overstepping his bounds as a guard. Captain Reynolds was a 25-year veteran of royal protection, a man who had served 3 monarchs and prided himself on never questioning orders. He listened to Marcus's report with the same expression he might wear while reviewing grocery lists, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Guard Wellington, Reynolds said when Marcus finished speaking, you've served this family with distinction for 12 years. I trust you understand the delicate nature of royal child rearing. The methods may seem harsh to outsiders, but they've been refined over centuries to produce leaders capable of bearing the weight of the crown. Marcus felt his stomach sink, but he pressed on. Sir, with respect, what I witnessed wasn't education. It was abuse. Prince Louis is 7 years old. He's being systematically broken down by people who are supposed to protect him. Reynolds's expression hardened. Guard Wellington, you are assigned to observe and protect, not to psychoanalyze royal child development. The palace employs experts in these matters, people with degrees and decades of experience. Your job is to ensure physical safety, not to question methods that have successfully prepared generations of royals for their duties. But, sir, the prince is showing signs of trauma. He flinches when adults approach him. He's lost weight. Yesterday I saw him having what looked like a panic attack during a simple photo session with his grandmother. Enough. Reynolds's voice cut through the air like a blade. You will return to your duties, Guard Wellington. You will file standard reports using standard language. You will not discuss what you believe you have observed with anyone, including other guards, staff members, or outside parties. The Official Secrets Act covers everything that happens within these walls, as you well know. Marcus left the meeting knowing that his concerns had not just been dismissed, but that speaking up again could cost him his career and, possibly, his freedom. The Official Secrets Act was no joke. Guards who violated it didn't just lose their jobs, they faced prison time. But, as the weeks passed, the situation with Prince Louis only got worse. The special training sessions became more frequent and more intense. The boy began to stutter during public appearances, his natural confidence replaced by a nervousness that made Marcus's heart ache. Other guards started noticing too, but none were willing to speak up after word quietly spread that questioning royal child-rearing methods was a career-ending offense. The palace machine continued its work with ruthless efficiency. Press releases spoke of Prince Louis's intensive preparation for his future role, with quotes from unnamed palace sources praising his remarkable progress in understanding the gravity of his position. Photos were carefully staged to hide the dark circles under his eyes, and public appearances were limited to brief moments where his discomfort wouldn't be obvious. Marcus found himself assigned to Prince Louis's protection detail more frequently, which meant he had a front-row seat to the systematic destruction of a child's spirit. He watched the boy's natural curiosity wither under constant criticism. He saw the 7-year-old's playful nature disappear as he learned that any expression of joy or spontaneity would be met with stern lectures about appropriate behavior for someone in your position. The worst part was how quickly Prince Louis adapted to his new reality. Within 6 weeks of the special training beginning, the boy had learned to anticipate criticism and punish himself before others could do it for him. Marcus watched in horror as Prince Louis began apologizing for things he hadn't even done yet, his small voice constantly asking, "Is this right? Am I doing this correctly? I'm sorry. During one particularly difficult evening, Marcus was assigned to escort Prince Louis to his bedroom after a day-long series of command exercises that had left the child exhausted and defeated. As they walked through the quiet corridors of the palace, Prince Louis suddenly stopped and looked up at Marcus with eyes that seemed far too old for his 7-year-old face. "Am I a bad prince?" the boy asked quietly. "Everyone keeps saying I need to do better, but I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. I try so hard, but nothing I do is right." Marcus felt his heart break completely in that moment. Every protocol, every rule, every threat about the official secrets act seemed insignificant compared to the pain in those innocent blue eyes. He knelt down to Prince Louis's level, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not a bad prince, Your Highness. You're a good boy who's being asked to do things that are too hard for anyone your age. The problem isn't with you." Prince Louis's eyes filled with tears. "But, if the problem isn't with me, why won't anyone make it stop?" Marcus had no answer that wouldn't destroy what little faith the child might still have in the adults around him. Instead, he simply said, "Sometimes good people have to be very brave and very patient while they figure out how to fix big problems." "Are you trying to fix it?" Prince Louis asked with the heartbreaking hope that only children can manage in the darkest circumstances. Marcus looked into those trusting eyes and made a decision that would change everything. "Yes, Your Highness. I'm trying to fix it." It was a promise that would cost him everything he had worked for, but, as he tucked Prince Louis into bed that night and watched the exhausted child finally fall into peaceful sleep, Marcus knew he would rather lose his career than lose his soul. The next morning, Marcus began documenting everything. Every cruel comment from tutors, every humiliating exercise, every moment when a 7-year-old boy was treated like an enemy to be defeated rather than a child to be nurtured. He knew that speaking up within the system had failed, and that meant he would have to go outside the system. It was a dangerous game he was beginning to play, one that could land him in prison and destroy his life. But every time he wavered, he remembered Prince Louis's question, "Are you trying to fix it?" Some promises are too important to break, even when keeping them might destroy you. Marcus had made his choice. Now he had to figure out how to keep his word without getting both himself and Prince Louis destroyed in the process. The truth about what was happening to Prince Louis needed to be told, but telling it safely would require careful planning, powerful allies, and more courage than Marcus had ever needed before. As he stood at his post that gray Tuesday morning, watching the blue drawing room where another training session was about to begin, Marcus began to plan the most important mission of his career. He was going to save a prince, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had ever worked for. The documentation began in Marcus's small flat in Pimlico, just a 15-minute walk from Buckingham Palace. Every evening after his shift, he would sit at his kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notebook, carefully recording everything he had witnessed that day. The entries were clinical, precise, and heartbreaking. November 15, Prince Louis forced to stand at attention for 90 minutes during posture training. Child visibly swaying by the end, but when he asked for water was told that real princes don't show weakness. Denied break until he agreed to repeat exercise tomorrow, November 16, during language lesson, Prince Louis mispronounced French word. Tutor made him write "I will speak properly" 200 times while standing. Hand cramping visible by line 150. Other children allowed to sit and use computers for same lesson, November 18, command exercise in throne room. Prince Louis told to command staff to perform increasingly humiliating tasks. When child refused to order janitor to crawl on hands and knees, was lectured for 2 hours about necessary authority and weakness of character. Each entry felt like a small betrayal of his oath as a royal guard, but Marcus forced himself to continue. If he was going to expose what was happening, he needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the emotional observations of a disgruntled employee. The most difficult part was maintaining his professional demeanor during the day while watching Prince Louis deteriorate before his eyes. The boy had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking his posture, his small hands automatically straightening his shoulders every few minutes as if he could hear his tutor's criticism even when they weren't around. He had also stopped making eye contact with adults unless specifically ordered to do so, his natural confidence replaced by a fearful deference that made Marcus sick to watch. But it wasn't just the obvious changes that worried Marcus. Prince Louis had begun showing signs of what any child psychologist would recognize as trauma responses. The boy startled at unexpected noises, had trouble concentrating during simple activities, and seemed to be constantly braced for the next criticism or punishment. During one particularly disturbing incident, Marcus watched as Prince Louis actually flinched away from his own father when Prince William tried to ruffle his hair during a casual family moment. The isolation was also becoming more pronounced. While Princess Charlotte and Prince George were allowed to interact with other children during carefully supervised playdates, Prince Louis's social contact was limited to palace staff and his increasingly harsh tutors. The reason given was that he needed intensive preparation for his unique role, but Marcus suspected the real motivation was to prevent outside observers from noticing the changes in the boy's behavior. 3 weeks into his documentation project, Marcus realized he needed help. The evidence he was gathering was damning, but he wasn't sure how to use it effectively. The traditional channels within the palace had already proven useless, and going directly to the press seemed both dangerous and potentially ineffective. Royal scandals had a way of being quietly buried, and whistleblowers had a way of disappearing from public view. The answer came from an unexpected source. During his morning commute, Marcus noticed he was regularly sharing the tube carriage with a woman who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling sensitive information. After observing her for several days, he noticed she always carried files marked with the logo of a prominent human rights organization. It took Marcus 3 more days to work up the courage to approach her. On a rainy Thursday morning, as the train pulled into Victoria Station, he found himself standing next to her as passengers prepared to disembark. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "I couldn't help but notice you work with children's rights issues." The woman, who Marcus later learned was named Sarah Chan, looked at him with the sharp attention of someone trained to evaluate potential sources. "I do," she said carefully. "Can I help you with something?" "I think I might have information about a child who's being abused," Marcus said, the words feeling strange and terrifying as they left his mouth. "But the situation is complicated." Sarah handed him a business card. "Complicated situations are what we specialize in. Call me when you're ready to talk." That evening, Marcus stared at the card for 2 hours before finally picking up his phone. The conversation that followed would prove to be the beginning of the most dangerous and important work of his life. Sarah Chen, it turned out, was a senior investigator for Child Protection International, an organization with experience handling cases involving powerful people and institutions. She had worked on cases involving celebrities, politicians, and even minor royalty from other countries. More importantly, she understood the legal complexities of whistleblowing and had connections with journalists who specialized in investigative work that powerful people preferred to keep buried. Their first meeting took place in a quiet cafe in Borough Market, far from the palace and the types of establishments where royal staff typically gathered. Marcus had chosen civilian clothes and taken a circuitous route to ensure he wasn't followed. The precautions felt paranoid, but his 12 years of security training had taught him that paranoia was often just good preparation. Sarah listened to his initial account without interruption, taking notes in a shorthand that Marcus couldn't read. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "What you're describing sounds like systematic psychological abuse disguised as education," she said finally. "Unfortunately, it's more common than most people realize, especially in families where children are being prepared for positions of power. The difference here is that we're talking about someone who will never have any legal recourse because of who he is." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "Think about it," Sarah explained. "If this were happening to any other 7-year-old in Britain, the child would have legal protections. Teachers, doctors, social workers would be mandated to report suspected abuse. But Prince Louis exists in a bubble where the normal safeguards don't apply. The people around him aren't going to report anything because their careers depend on the palace. And the palace isn't going to investigate itself. The reality of Prince Louis's situation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The boy was completely trapped, surrounded by people who either participated in his abuse or were too frightened to speak up against it. "So what can we do?" he asked. "We document everything," Sarah said. "We build a case so solid that it can't be ignored or dismissed. And then, we find a way to get it to people with the power and courage to act on it." Over the following weeks, Sarah helped Marcus refine his documentation process. She taught him how to note specific times, dates, and witnesses in ways that would be legally useful. She also helped him understand which behaviors and incidents would be most compelling to outside observers who might not understand the subtleties of palace life. Meanwhile, the situation with Prince Louis continued to deteriorate. The special training had expanded beyond the formal sessions to include constant monitoring and correction of the boy's behavior throughout the day. Palace staff had been instructed to report any instance of inappropriate conduct, which seemed to include everything from smiling too much during formal events to asking questions about why his routine was different from his siblings. Marcus began to notice other staff members stealing glances at Prince Louis with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. Some seemed genuinely troubled by what they were witnessing, but fear of losing their positions kept them silent. Others appeared to have bought into the narrative that the prince was somehow defective and needed harsh correction to become a proper royal. The breaking point came during a particularly cruel command exercise in early December. Prince Louis had been ordered to direct a group of junior staff members in setting up a formal dining room, but the staff had been secretly instructed to ignore everything he said and to become increasingly insubordinate as the exercise progressed. Marcus watched from his position by the door as the 7-year-old prince tried desperately to figure out why his polite requests were being met with eye rolls and deliberately clumsy mistakes. When Prince Louis finally raised his voice in frustration, he was immediately pounced on by his tutors for losing control and failing to command respect. "This is exactly why you need this training," one of the advisors had said coldly while Prince Louis stood trembling with exhaustion and confusion. A real prince would have had this room set up properly in 10 minutes. "You've been at this for over an hour, and you still can't get a simple task completed. What does that tell you about your fitness for your future role?" Prince Louis, his voice barely a whisper, had replied, "That I'm not good enough to be a prince." "Correct," the advisor had said with satisfaction. "Now, you'll repeat this exercise every day until you can complete it properly, and you'll think about your failures during your rest time instead of playing with toys like a common child." That night, Marcus made a decision that would put both his career and his freedom at serious risk. He activated the recording app on his phone and left it running during his next shift. The audio he captured over the following week was damning beyond anything he had imagined. Hours of a 7-year-old child being systematically humiliated by adults who spoke to him with a cruelty that would have been shocking if directed at a prisoner of war. The recordings captured not just the obvious abuse, but also the casual way the staff discussed breaking the child's spirit as if it were a normal part of their job. "He's still too willful," one tutor could be heard saying to another. "We need to increase the pressure until he stops thinking he has any right to opinions or preferences." "The crying is good," another voice responded. "Shows we're making progress." Once he learns that resistance only makes things worse for him, he'll be much more manageable. When Marcus played the recordings for Sarah, she had to excuse herself twice to regain her composure. When she returned from her second break, her eyes were red but her voice was steady. "This is prosecutable," she said quietly. "If we can get this information to the right people, we can force an investigation that the palace won't be able to stop or cover up." But even as they planned their next steps, Marcus knew they were walking into dangerous territory. The Official Secrets Act wasn't just a threat to his career, it was a law that could send him to prison for years if he was caught revealing confidential information about the royal family. And the people they were preparing to expose had resources and connections that most whistleblowers could never imagine facing. The question was no longer whether Marcus was willing to risk his own future to save Prince Louis. The question was whether he could do it effectively enough to actually help the boy, or whether his exposure would just result in both of their lives being destroyed while the abuse continued in secret. As Christmas approached, Marcus could see that time was running out. Prince Louis was showing signs of severe psychological distress that were becoming harder to hide during public appearances. The boy had lost even more weight, his sleep was clearly disrupted, and he had developed a concerning habit of apologizing for things that weren't his fault or hadn't even happened. During one heartbreaking conversation, Prince Louis had asked Marcus if he thought God was angry with him for being such a bad prince. The question had come out of nowhere during what should have been a routine escort to the library, and it revealed just how completely the 7-year-old had internalized the constant criticism and emotional abuse. "Your Highness," Marcus had said, kneeling down to the boy's level, "God isn't angry with you. You're a good boy who's being treated badly by people who should know better." "But, if they should know better, why don't they?" Prince Louis had asked with the devastating logic that only children possess. Marcus had no answer that wouldn't either lie to the child or completely destroy what little faith he might still have in the adults around him. Instead, he had simply said, "Sometimes it takes time for people to learn how to do the right thing. But, there are people working to help you, even if you can't see them right now." It was a promise that Marcus was determined to keep, even if it destroyed him in the process. The evidence was ready, the contacts were in place, and the plan was starting to come together. But, the most dangerous part was still ahead, actually revealing the truth about what was happening to Prince Louis without getting both of them killed in the process. As Marcus stood at his post that evening, watching over a child who trusted him to somehow make the nightmare stop, he knew that the next few weeks would determine whether his 12 years of service to the crown would end with him saving a prince or destroying both their lives in a failed attempt at doing the right thing. The plan Sarah Chen developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. They would not go to the traditional British press, which had complex relationships with the palace and might be pressured to bury the story. Instead, they would approach an investigative journalist from The Guardian who specialized in institutional abuse cases and had a reputation for protecting sources even under intense legal pressure. The journalist, Rebecca Morrison, had previously exposed abuse in prestigious boarding schools and religious institutions. More importantly, she had successfully navigated the legal challenges that came with investigating powerful people who had the resources to destroy careers and bankrupt critics. Sarah had worked with her before and trusted her ability to handle sensitive material without compromising source protection. But, first, they needed more than just Marcus's testimony and recordings. They needed corroboration from other witnesses, medical documentation of Prince Louis's psychological state, and evidence that the abuse was systematic rather than isolated incidents. This meant expanding their investigation in ways that dramatically increased the risk of discovery. Sarah suggested starting with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a child psychologist who had occasionally consulted for the palace on educational matters. Dr. Vasquez had observed some of Prince Louis's training sessions and might be willing to provide professional analysis of what she had witnessed, especially if she understood that a child's welfare was at stake. The approach would have to be carefully orchestrated. Marcus couldn't contact Dr. Vasquez directly without raising suspicions, and Sarah's organization couldn't approach her without revealing that they were investigating the palace. The solution came from Rebecca Morrison, who agreed to interview Dr. Vasquez for a general article about childhood development in high-pressure environments. During that interview, conducted at Dr. Vasquez's private practice in Harley Street, Rebecca carefully guided the conversation toward the psychological effects of intensive preparation programs for children in leadership positions. Without mentioning Prince Louis specifically, she described scenarios that matched what Marcus had documented and asked for the psychologist's professional opinion. Dr. Vasquez's responses were damning. She described the scenarios as textbook psychological abuse designed to break down a child's sense of self and replace it with learned helplessness. She went on to explain that children subjected to such treatment often developed anxiety disorders, depression, and difficulty forming healthy relationships later in life. When Rebecca asked if Dr. Vasquez had ever witnessed such treatment in her consulting work, the psychologist's carefully professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I've seen things that concern me," she admitted. "But, when you're dealing with powerful institutions, speaking up about your concerns can end your career very quickly." The children suffer, and the adults who could help them stay silent to protect themselves. It wasn't a direct admission, but it was enough to establish that professional observers had noticed problems with Prince Louis's treatment and felt unable to intervene through normal channels. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Marcus had noticed that one of the junior household staff, a young woman named Katie Hughes who worked in the children's wing, had begun looking increasingly distressed during her shifts. She was often assigned to clean Prince Louis's room and had clearly witnessed the aftermath of his training sessions. Katie was 23 years old, fresh out of university, and had taken the job at the palace because she thought it would be an honor to serve the royal family. What she found instead was a nightmare that was slowly destroying her faith in institutions she had been raised to respect. Marcus began carefully observing Katie's behavior and noticed that she often lingered outside Prince Louis's room after difficult days, as if she wanted to check on him but didn't dare enter. She also had a habit of leaving small treats and encouraging notes where the prince might find them, always arranged to look like accidents so she couldn't be accused of violating protocol. The opportunity to approach Katie came when Marcus overheard her crying in his storage closet after a particularly brutal command exercise that had left Prince Louis shaking and barely able to stand. Marcus waited until she emerged, then followed her to an empty corridor. "Katie," he said quietly, "are you all right?" She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and seemed to struggle with how to answer. Palace staff were not supposed to discuss their emotional responses to their work, especially with guards who might report their concerns to supervisors. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice broke on the words. Marcus made a decision that violated every protocol he had been taught about maintaining professional distance from other staff members. "What's happening to Prince Louis isn't right," he said directly. "You know it, I know it, and a lot of other people here know it. The question is what we're going to do about it." Katie stared at him for several seconds, clearly shocked that someone had finally said out loud what they were all thinking. "What can we do?" she whispered. "If we speak up, they'll fire us. And then, who will be left to care about him at all?" "There might be ways to help him that don't involve losing our jobs," Marcus said carefully. "But it would require trusting some people outside the palace who specialize in protecting children." It took 3 more conversations before Katie agreed to meet with Sarah Chen. The meeting took place in a pub in Camden, far from the palace and the types of establishments where royal staff were likely to be recognized. Katie was nervous throughout the conversation, but her account of what she had witnessed corroborated and expanded on everything Marcus had documented. Katie had seen the aftermath of Prince Louis's training sessions in ways that Marcus, positioned outside the rooms, had not. She described finding the 7-year-old prince curled up in his bathroom, crying silently because he had learned that audible tears brought punishment. She had discovered hidden stashes of food in his room, evidence that he was hoarding meals because his food intake was being controlled as part of his discipline. Most disturbing of all, Katie had found drawings that Prince Louis had made and then tried to destroy. The artwork showed stick figures of adults towering over a tiny child, with dark scribbles covering the small figure as if the child was being erased. When Katie had tried to comfort the prince about his art, he had begged her not to tell anyone about the drawings because they'll say I'm being dramatic again. "He's just a little boy," Katie had said through tears during her conversation with Sarah. "He should be playing with toys and watching cartoons, not lying awake at night worrying about whether he's disappointing everyone just by existing." With Katie's testimony and Dr. Vasquez's professional analysis, the case against Prince Louis's treatment was becoming undeniable. But Marcus knew they still needed one more piece of evidence before Rebecca Morrison could publish her investigation. They needed proof that the abuse was being orchestrated from the highest levels of palace management, not just carried out by rogue tutors or overzealous staff members. The opportunity to obtain that proof came during a meeting Marcus was assigned to guard in early January. Senior palace advisors were gathering to discuss adjustments to Prince Louis's training program, supposedly in response to concerns about his slow progress. Marcus was positioned outside the conference room, but the door was slightly ajar and the participants spoke freely, apparently confident that their conversation was private. What Marcus heard during that meeting confirmed his worst suspicions about the systematic nature of Prince Louis's abuse. The advisors discussed the 7-year-old's psychological state with clinical detachment, debating whether to increase the intensity of his training or to try different methods of breaking down his resistance. The boy still shows too much independence of thought, one voice said. We need him to understand that his role is to follow instructions without question, not to have opinions about his circumstances. Perhaps we should consider isolation protocols, another participant suggested. Limited contact with his siblings might help him understand that his position is fundamentally different from theirs. We've already restricted his access to normal childhood activities, a third voice noted. Any further isolation might attract attention from outside observers. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with palace officials discussing Prince Louis as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a child to be nurtured. They spoke about breaking him, molding him, and ensuring complete compliance with a coldness that made Marcus feel physically sick. The most chilling moment came when someone asked whether they should be concerned about the long-term psychological effects of their methods. That's not our primary concern, came the response. Our job is to produce a royal who will never question authority or create problems for the institution. If that requires some psychological adjustment, then that's an acceptable cost. Better a damaged prince who follows orders than a healthy one who might someday challenge the system. Marcus recorded the entire conversation, though doing so required him to risk moving closer to the door and, potentially being discovered. When the meeting ended, he remained at his post with the same neutral expression he had worn for 12 years, but, internally he was reeling from what he had learned. The people responsible for Prince Louis's care weren't misguided educators trying to prepare him for royal duties. They were institutional operatives systematically destroying a child's psychological development because they viewed his natural personality as a threat to royal stability. The abuse wasn't a byproduct of their methods, it was the intended result. That evening, Marcus met with Sarah and played the recording of the meeting. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked completely as she listened to adults discussing the systematic psychological abuse of a 7-year-old with the same tone they might use to discuss quarterly budget reports. This is enough, she said when the recording ended. We have witness testimony, professional psychological analysis, audio evidence of systematic abuse, and, now proof that it's being orchestrated at the highest levels. Rebecca can publish this story with confidence that it will stand up to any legal challenge. But, even as they prepared to move forward with the investigation, Marcus felt a growing sense of dread about what would happen once the story became public. The palace had enormous resources and sophisticated public relations machinery. They could discredit witnesses, question motives, and probably make the whole scandal disappear within a few news cycles. More importantly, what would happen to Prince Louis once the palace realized that their methods had been exposed? Would they simply find more subtle ways to continue the abuse, or would the public attention actually force them to change their treatment of the boy? What if this backfires? Marcus asked Sarah during their final planning meeting. What if exposing this just makes them better at hiding what they're doing to him? Sarah was quiet for several minutes before responding. There's always a risk when you expose institutional abuse, she admitted. Sometimes the institutions do get better at hiding their problems instead of actually fixing them. But, the alternative is definitely unacceptable. If we stay silent, we know for certain that Prince Louis will continue to be abused. If we speak up, at least there's a chance that public pressure will force them to stop. She paused, then continued. Besides, once this story breaks, Prince Louis will no longer be suffering in isolation. The whole world will be watching how the palace treats him, and that kind of scrutiny makes it much harder to continue systematic abuse. Marcus knew she was right, but the decision to move forward still felt like stepping off a cliff. He had spent 12 years building a career in royal protection, and he was about to destroy it all based on the hope that exposing Prince Louis's abuse would actually help the boy rather than making his situation worse. But, every time Marcus wavered in his resolve, he remembered Prince Louis's question, "Are you trying to fix it?" Some promises were too important to break, even when keeping them required sacrificing everything you had worked for. The story was ready to publish. The evidence was overwhelming, the sources were protected, and Rebecca Morrison had verified every detail through multiple channels. All that remained was to release information that would shake the British monarchy to its foundation and pray that a 7-year-old prince would be saved rather than destroyed by the chaos that was about to unfold. Marcus had made his choice 12 weeks earlier when he promised Prince Louis that someone was trying to fix the nightmare of his daily existence. now it was time to keep that promise, regardless of what it cost him personally. The truth about Prince Louis's treatment was going to come out, and nothing would ever be the same again for any of them. Rebecca Morrison's investigation was published on a Tuesday morning in February, and, by noon it had become the most read article in The Guardian's history. The headline was stark and devastating: Palace Insider reveals systematic abuse of 7-year-old Prince Louis, audio evidence shows senior advisors orchestrating psychological torture. The article was comprehensive, methodical, and absolutely damning. Rebecca had woven together Marcus's testimony, Katie's observations, Dr. Vasquez's professional analysis, and the recorded conversations into a narrative that painted a horrifying picture of institutional child abuse at the highest levels of British society. The audio recordings were particularly powerful. Hearing adults discuss the systematic psychological destruction of a 7-year-old with clinical detachment was shocking enough that several major news outlets initially refused to broadcast excerpts, believing them to be too disturbing for general audiences. The palace's initial response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the article's publication, a statement was released categorically denying all allegations and describing the claims as malicious fabrications by disgruntled employees seeking to damage the reputation of the royal family. The statement went on to characterize Prince Louis's education as age-appropriate preparation for his future role and suggested that the sources quoted in the article were either lying or had misunderstood normal educational practices. The palace also hinted at legal action against The Guardian and anyone who had participated in what they called a coordinated attack on the crown. But the evidence Rebecca had assembled was too comprehensive to be dismissed easily. The audio recordings, in particular, were devastating because they featured voices that could be identified by anyone familiar with palace operations. Within hours of the article's publication, former palace employees began coming forward to confirm the identities of the speakers and to add their own accounts of what they had witnessed. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with outrage as people shared clips from the recordings and expressed horror at what was being done to Prince Louis. Child protection organizations issued statements calling for immediate investigation, and several MPs demanded parliamentary hearings into the palace's treatment of royal children. Most importantly, the story had the international reach that domestic British coverage might have lacked. American networks picked up the story within hours, followed by major outlets in Canada, Australia, and across Europe. The systematic abuse of a 7-year-old prince became global news in a way that made it impossible for the palace to quietly manage the crisis through their usual channels. Marcus watched the story explode from his flat in Pimlico, where he had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into the source of the leaks. He knew it was only a matter of time before his role in exposing the abuse was discovered, but, for the moment, he was simply another palace employee under general suspicion. The most gratifying aspect of the coverage was how quickly experts began confirming what he had observed. Child psychologists interviewed by various news outlets described the treatment documented in Rebecca's article as textbook psychological abuse and warned about the long-term damage such methods could cause to a developing child. Dr. Janet Thornfield, a leading expert in childhood trauma, appeared on BBC News and provided analysis that validated everything Marcus had documented. "What's been described here isn't education or preparation for leadership," she said. "It's systematic psychological torture designed to break down a child's sense of self and replace it with learned helplessness. The adults responsible for this should be facing criminal charges, not continuing to have access to this child." But the most powerful voices in the growing chorus of outrage came from unexpected sources. Several adult survivors of institutional abuse, including former students from elite boarding schools and children of other prominent families, began sharing their own stories of systematic psychological manipulation disguised as character building. Lady Margaret Ashford, now in her 50s, published an op-ed describing similar treatment she had received as a child in a prominent family. "They told me it was necessary to break my spirit so they could rebuild me properly," she wrote. "I spent decades in therapy trying to undo the damage they did, and I still struggle with anxiety and self-worth issues. No child should endure what Prince Louis is being put through, regardless of their position in society." The accumulating testimony from experts and survivors made it increasingly difficult for the palace to maintain their narrative that Prince Louis's treatment was normal or appropriate. Public opinion was shifting rapidly from skepticism to outrage, and the pressure for official investigation was mounting. 3 days after the article's publication, the first cracks appeared in the palace's united front. An unnamed senior staff member was quoted in the Times suggesting that there had been concerns about Prince Louis's educational program but that anyone who raised questions had been dismissed or transferred to other duties. More significantly, medical records began to emerge. A pediatrician who had examined Prince Louis during a routine checkup came forward with documentation showing that the 7-year-old had lost 15 pounds over the previous 4 months and showed signs of chronic stress, including disrupted sleep patterns and elevated cortisol levels. The medical evidence was particularly damaging because it provided objective proof that Prince Louis's health was being affected by his treatment. The palace could claim that their educational methods were appropriate, but they couldn't easily explain away documented physical evidence of a child's deteriorating condition. On Friday of that week, 4 days after the story broke, Prince William and Catherine made their first public appearance since the scandal erupted. They were attending a previously scheduled engagement at a children's hospital, and the optics could not have been worse. Reporters shouted questions about Prince Louis's treatment while the couple tried to maintain composure during what was supposed to be a feel-good publicity event. The most damaging moment came when a reporter asked Prince William directly if he was aware of his son's treatment and whether he supported the methods being used. William's visible anger as he snapped no comment and walked away was captured by every camera present and became the defining image of the royal family's response to the crisis. Catherine's reaction was even more telling. She appeared visibly shaken throughout the event and was overheard by several reporters asking her security detail if they could check on Louis when they returned to the palace. The exchange suggested that even Prince Louis's parents might not have been fully aware of the extent of his treatment. By the end of the first week, the scandal had become a constitutional crisis. Opposition MPs were calling for parliamentary investigation into the palace's child welfare practices, and several international child protection organizations were demanding access to examine Prince Louis's condition. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the child psychologist who had provided background analysis for Rebecca's article, decided to go public with her direct observations of Prince Louis's condition. In a carefully coordinated television interview, Dr. Vasquez revealed that she had been brought in to consult on Prince Louis's educational difficulties and had been horrified by what she observed. She described watching the 7-year-old prince during one of his command exercises and seeing behavior that she immediately recognized as trauma responses. The child was exhibiting classic signs of learned helplessness, she explained to the interviewer. He flinched when adults approached him, apologized constantly for things that weren't his fault, and showed the kind of hypervigilance you see in children who've been systematically abused. When I tried to raise concerns about his psychological state, I was told that my services were no longer needed. Dr. Vasquez's decision to speak publicly was devastating to the palace's credibility because she was a respected professional with no obvious axe to grind. Her testimony also revealed that there had been multiple opportunities for intervention that were deliberately ignored by palace officials. The final blow to the palace's narrative came when Katie Hughes decided to go public with her account. In an interview with ITV News, she described finding Prince Louis hiding in his bathroom, explaining that he went there to cry because he had learned that visible tears brought punishment. "He's 7 years old," Katie said, barely able to maintain her composure during the interview. "He should be playing and laughing, not learning to hide his emotions because showing normal human feelings gets him in trouble. What they're doing to him isn't education, it's torture." Katie's testimony was particularly powerful because her youth and obvious distress made it clear that she had nothing to gain from speaking out and everything to lose. Her decision to risk her career to protect Prince Louis resonated with viewers and added human emotion to what could have been merely an academic discussion of child welfare. By the second week of the scandal, the palace's position was becoming untenable. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, public opinion had shifted decisively against them, and international pressure was mounting for official investigation. Several countries had begun making diplomatic inquiries about the welfare of Prince Louis, treating the situation as a matter of international child protection rather than internal British affairs. The turning point came when Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby issued a statement calling for immediate and transparent investigation into Prince Louis's treatment. the Archbishop's intervention was significant because it represented the official position of the Church of England, which had historically maintained careful neutrality in royal family matters. The protection of children is a sacred responsibility that transcends all other considerations, the Archbishop stated. If these allegations are true, then those responsible must be held accountable, regardless of their position or the institutions they represent. The Archbishop's statement was followed by similar calls from the leaders of other major religious denominations, creating a moral consensus that made the palace's position increasingly isolated. The scandal was no longer just about palace management practices, it had become a test of British society's commitment to protecting vulnerable children. Marcus watched these developments unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The exposure was having exactly the effect Sarah Chen had predicted. It was becoming impossible for the palace to continue Prince Louis's abuse in the face of sustained international scrutiny. But Marcus also knew that powerful institutions didn't surrender easily, and he suspected the palace was planning some kind of counterattack. His suspicions proved correct when he was summoned for questioning by palace security on the Friday of the second week. The interview was conducted by Captain Reynolds and two investigators Marcus didn't recognize, and their questions made it clear they suspected his involvement in the leaks. "Guard Wellington," Reynolds began, "you've served this family with distinction for 12 years. I trust you understand the serious nature of the allegations that have been made and the importance of finding those responsible for these malicious attacks on the crown." Marcus kept his expression neutral as he replied, "I understand the seriousness of the situation, sir." "Good. Then, you'll understand why we need to know if you've observed anything that might help us identify the sources of these fabricated stories. Have you noticed any unusual behavior from other staff members? Any inappropriate interest in Prince Louis's educational activities?" It was a carefully worded question designed to trap Marcus into either admitting his own involvement or implicating other innocent staff members. Marcus had prepared for this moment and knew exactly how to respond. "Sir, I've observed the same things that have been reported in the press," he said. "The difference is that I was taught to keep quiet about palace operations, while apparently some people decided that protecting a child was more important than protecting the institution." The response hit its target perfectly. Reynolds's face darkened as he realized that Marcus was neither denying the allegations nor agreeing to help identify their sources. The other investigators leaned forward, clearly recognizing a confession when they heard one. "Are you saying you believe these allegations are true?" one of them asked. "I'm saying I've seen enough to understand why someone might feel compelled to speak up," Marcus replied. "Sometimes keeping silent makes you complicit in things you can't live with." The interview continued for another hour, but Marcus knew the outcome was predetermined. By admitting that he believed the allegations and suggesting that silence was complicity, he had essentially confessed to being either a source or a supporter of the investigation. His career as a royal guard was over, but Prince Louis might finally get the protection he needed. As Marcus left the interview room, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For 12 years, he had maintained the perfect facade of the loyal royal guard, but the cost of that loyalty had almost destroyed his soul. Speaking the truth, even knowing it would end his career, felt like stepping out of a prison he hadn't known he was in. The real test of his decision would come in the days ahead, when the palace's response to the investigation would determine whether Prince Louis would finally be protected or whether the institution would find new ways to continue the abuse while avoiding public scrutiny. The palace's counterattack began within hours of Marcus's termination. By Monday morning, a coordinated campaign was underway to discredit him, Katie Hughes, and anyone else who had spoken publicly about Prince Louis's treatment. Anonymous briefings to friendly journalists portrayed the whistleblowers as disgruntled employees with personal grievances against the royal family. Marcus woke up to find photographers outside his flat and journalists shouting questions about his vendetta against the crown. The palace's media operation had been swift and ruthless, painting him as a bitter ex-employee seeking revenge rather than a concerned professional trying to protect a child. The attacks were personal and devastating. Stories appeared suggesting that Marcus had been disciplined multiple times for inappropriate behavior during his tenure, though no evidence was provided and no specific incidents were described. Other articles hinted at financial difficulties that might have motivated him to sell information to the press, despite the fact that he had received no payment for his testimony. Katie Hughes faced even worse treatment. As a young woman from a working-class background, she was portrayed as someone who had infiltrated palace employment with the intention of creating a scandal. Anonymous sources suggested she had been starstruck by royal proximity and had fabricated stories to gain attention after being passed over for promotion. The personal attacks were clearly designed to shift focus away from the evidence of Prince Louis's abuse and toward questions about the credibility and motivations of those who had exposed it. It was a classic institutional defense strategy: when you can't attack the evidence, attack the witnesses. But the palace had underestimated both the strength of the evidence and the depth of public concern. The audio recordings couldn't be explained away by personal attacks on Marcus or Katie, and Dr. Vasquez's professional credentials made her testimony difficult to dismiss. More importantly, the story had generated enough international attention that British media outlets couldn't simply ignore it in favor of palace-friendly narratives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Queen Elizabeth II, who had remained conspicuously silent since the scandal erupted, issued a statement through Buckingham Palace that stunned royal watchers and political observers alike. "The welfare of all royal children is of paramount importance to the Crown," the statement read. "Recent allegations concerning the treatment of Prince Louis are deeply concerning and will be investigated thoroughly by independent experts. Any practices found to be harmful to the physical or emotional well-being of royal children will be immediately discontinued, and those responsible will be held accountable." The Queen's statement was remarkable for several reasons. First, it acknowledged that the allegations might be true, breaking with the palace's previous position of categorical denial. Second, it promised independent investigation rather than internal review, suggesting that the usual palace damage control mechanisms had been deemed insufficient. Most importantly, it came from the Queen herself rather than palace spokespersons, giving it a weight and authority that couldn't be ignored. Royal historians later suggested that the Queen's intervention had been motivated by her recognition that the scandal was threatening the monarchy's long-term credibility. Public opinion polls showed growing skepticism about the royal family's fitness to govern themselves, let alone the country, and the international criticism was damaging Britain's reputation as a civilized democracy. But Marcus suspected the Queen's motivations might have been more personal. Elizabeth II had been a grandmother for decades and had watched her own children struggle with the pressures of royal life. The possibility that her great-grandson was being systematically abused in the name of royal preparation might have touched something deeper than political calculation. The independent investigation promised in the Queen's statement was led by Lady Margaret Dawson, a former High Court judge with extensive experience in child welfare cases. Lady Dawson's appointment was significant because she had no previous connection to the royal family and was known for her uncompromising approach to institutional abuse cases. Within days of her appointment, Lady Dawson announced that she would be interviewing all staff members who had regular contact with Prince Louis, reviewing educational protocols, and conducting a comprehensive psychological assessment of the prince himself. She also made it clear that her investigation would have full access to palace records and that attempts to obstruct her work would be viewed as contempt of court. The psychological assessment of Prince Louis was conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a leading specialist in childhood trauma who had worked with survivors of institutional abuse. Her report, which was later released in redacted form, painted a devastating picture of a 7-year-old child showing clear signs of systematic psychological abuse. Prince Louis exhibited what Dr. Mitchell described as profound learned helplessness and hypervigilance consistent with chronic fear of punishment. The boy startled at unexpected sounds, apologized compulsively for normal behaviors, and showed signs of dissociation during stressful interactions. Most concerning was his apparent belief that he was bad and deserved harsh treatment because he failed to meet impossible standards. The medical examination revealed physical evidence supporting the psychological assessment. Prince Louis had lost significant weight, showed signs of chronic stress including elevated cortisol levels, and had developed a nervous tic that hadn't been present 6 months earlier. Sleep studies revealed severe disruption consistent with anxiety disorders. Dr. Mitchell's report concluded that Prince Louis had been subjected to systematic psychological abuse designed to break down normal childhood development and replace it with pathological compliance. She recommended immediate cessation of all special training programs, therapeutic intervention to address the trauma he had suffered, and careful monitoring to ensure his continued protection. The evidence compiled by Lady Dawson's investigation was so comprehensive and damning that the palace could no longer maintain any pretense that Prince Louis's treatment had been appropriate. The systematic nature of the abuse was documented in detail, and the psychological damage was quantified in ways that made denial impossible. But the investigation's most shocking revelation came when Lady Dawson uncovered the extent to which the abuse had been planned and coordinated. Internal memos revealed that senior palace advisors had developed what they called the Louis Protocol, a systematic plan to break down problematic personality traits and ensure complete institutional compliance. The protocol explicitly stated that Prince Louis's natural curiosity, independence, and emotional expressiveness were unsuitable for his future role and needed to be eliminated through appropriate intervention. The document outlined specific techniques for psychological manipulation, including isolation, arbitrary punishment, and constant criticism designed to undermine the child's self-worth. Most damaging of all was the discovery that the protocol had been approved at the highest levels of palace management. The systematic abuse of Prince Louis hadn't been the work of rogue employees or misguided tutors, it had been official policy implemented with the full knowledge and approval of senior advisors. When Lady Dawson's final report was published, it sent shockwaves through British society and beyond. The idea that the royal family's own advisors had developed and implemented a systematic plan to psychologically abuse a 7-year-old prince was so disturbing that many people initially refused to believe it. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The audio recordings Marcus had captured, the witness testimony from Katie and others, and the documentary evidence uncovered by Lady Dawson painted a picture of institutional child abuse that was both methodical and cruel. The public reaction was swift and decisive. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace demanding accountability for those responsible for Prince Louis's abuse. Several senior palace advisors named in the report were arrested and charged with child abuse, marking the first time in modern British history that royal household staff faced criminal prosecution for their treatment of royal family members. More significantly, Parliament voted to establish ongoing oversight of royal household practices, particularly those involving children. The days when the royal family could operate without external scrutiny were definitively over, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent future abuse. For Prince Louis himself, the aftermath of the investigation brought profound changes. All special training programs were immediately discontinued, and he was placed under the care of child psychologists specializing in trauma recovery. His education was redesigned to focus on normal childhood development rather than premature preparation for royal duties. The recovery process was slow and difficult. Months of systematic abuse don't disappear overnight, and Prince Louis struggled with anxiety, nightmares, and difficulty trusting adults. But, with proper therapeutic support and protection from further abuse, he gradually began to show signs of healing. Marcus watched these developments from his new position as a consultant with Child Protection International. Sarah Chen had offered him a job working on institutional abuse cases, and he had discovered a calling in protecting children that he had never found in royal service. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but it was also meaningful in ways that standing guard outside palace doors had never been. Every case Marcus worked on reminded him that children like Prince Louis existed in institutions around the world, and that speaking up for them was worth any personal cost. 6 months after the scandal broke, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at his new office. Katie Hughes had also left palace employment and was working as a child advocate with a different organization. She had come to thank him for giving her the courage to speak up about Prince Louis's treatment. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't said anything," she told him. "He would still be going through that hell, and no one would know or care. Sometimes doing the right thing is the only thing you can do, even when it's terrifying." Marcus agreed, but he also knew that their decision to speak up had been made possible by Prince Louis himself. The courage of a 7-year-old boy who continued to trust and hope despite systematic abuse had inspired adults to find their own courage and do what was necessary to protect him. The story of Prince Louis's abuse and rescue became a watershed moment in British society's relationship with institutional power. It demonstrated that no institution, no matter how venerable or powerful, was above accountability when it came to the protection of children. More importantly, it showed that ordinary people with access to extraordinary information had both the power and the responsibility to speak up when they witnessed systematic abuse. For Marcus, the end of his career as a royal guard marked the beginning of his real life's work. Every child he helped protect was a reminder that Prince Louis's nightmare had served a purpose. It had shown the world that courage, persistence, and moral clarity could triumph even against the most powerful institutions. The 7-year-old prince who had asked, "Are you trying to fix it?" had received his answer not just in words, but in actions that changed his life and potentially saved countless other children from similar abuse. Sometimes the most important promises are the ones that cost everything to keep, but that transform not just individual lives but entire societies in the process. Prince Louis was safe, the system that had abused him had been exposed and reformed, and Marcus Wellington had learned that there were things more important than career security or institutional loyalty. The truth, once spoken, had a power that no amount of wealth or influence could ultimately suppress. In the end, that truth had set them all free.